Art historians, and a lot of the art history classes that I took, find a myriad of details in paintings, through paintings, photographs, artifacts, and sculptures that reveal insights into history. The object that is left behind summarizes the maker, the intent, the energy that is summoned to make it, to use it, to care for it, or keep it. It's evolving. Like a book that changes with subsequent readings, the object reveals itself like a melting snowflake. Whether you aspire to write your family story or read one, Aristotle's third act story structure is a good place to start. We all know there's lots of story structures, but this one I used to watch TV, I used to read books. I always go to the 50% page, and that tells me what the whole book is about. Sometimes at the beginning, but sometimes as I get along, because I know that that's going to be the pivot. And a lot of people love to go to the last page to read first. I like to go to the 50% page. So whether you aspire to read your family story or to read one, this 3-act story structure is a good place to start. It's a macro habit of 3 acts that shows how to reveal your family's untold stories with a predictable pattern. I don't write thrillers or crime novels, but most of my historical characters have died before my first line is written. Their clues are in plain sight, and a lot of them I never noticed before. So telling a story can be the most effective if it's simple. In a bar bet, Ernest Hemingway challenged if a story could be written in 6 words. You probably have heard this, but he won the bet with "for sale, baby shoes, never worn." That's all you need for a story. But we like to write a lot, so we could edit it down to that Hemingway quick sentence, or have more of a Virginia Woolf, a sentence is as long as a paragraph. The 6-word story has empathy with 3 acts. The reader fills in the blanks with Aristotle's 3-act story structure. Act 1 is the problem or inciting incident. You introduce your character and the setting. At about 10%, state your theme. Is it unrequited love, or you can't go home again? Whatever the theme is that character will be going through. Then at about 25% at the first plot point, keep the pages turning. 25%, put in a twist. Just flip a twist on them and they'll be like, what? Why did that happen? So that rolls the plot to the 50% boiling point, or the change of the climax. At the boiling point or confrontation, the midpoint pivots. The character changes something. The plot with an essential revelation, or something is revealed, and it causes the character to change course. Add a dark moment after this, or some action that changes the plot after that huge climax change, and that's your second plot point. Act 3 offers a conclusion to resolve the original problem. The whole story is going to have this story structure to it. When my grandmother was bedridden, I drew out a bluebird in a tree. I was in, I guess, early college, and she needle pointed it. And my mother was so thrilled that we had this moment together where I designed something, and it gave her like a purpose at this point. So I still have this needlepoint from, I don't know, 1977 or something. And it was just one of the last things I did with my grandmother. So that's the kind of trigger that you might have. So all of those things are like kind of what we're looking for, that kind of a trigger that really means something when we glance at it in our everyday life. So writing from these family objects recounts sensory memory, emotions, and experience that's interwoven into a storyline. So you might have something that plucks your heartstrings, a diary, like this is her diary on the bottom. Every day she wrote a little something. Very hard to read. I need a magnifying glass for it, but it gave me insights into what her everyday was. These nouns then spring into verbs and a new life through writing. The memory flickers like a butterfly wing sound. the fleeting verb is captured in a written sentence, paragraph, and story. Set out to write about 500-word snippets inspired by family objects. As that fleeting emotion while you're folding a sweater happens, take the time to just sit down and write that and have it on your computer or in a notebook. And that's what you can build your stories from. I have this moment in my enlightening reveal. My father's art showed us his story with paintings for clues. He was a very quiet man and very busy with, I'm the 7th of 9 children, and he, by the time I'm 8 or 9 years old, ready to ask questions, he's got 5 kids in college. So he was a very busy guy, and a lot of family stories just never got passed along, to me at least. I find that I gather some during weddings and different family gatherings. But this painting was on the wall the whole time I was growing up and never thought much about it until he gave it to me as he passed away. And it's called Possible Grandparents. And I thought, oh yeah, I could end up looking like her someday. And isn't he tall and lean and athletic looking? And so I tried to imagine who my possible great grandparents were. We never asked about it, but that is the title of the painting my dad made of his grandparents. So I looked more closely at this painting. It's in a subway, but they're dressed to go out in the evening, maybe to a lecture, maybe to a concert, maybe to some kind of salon setting. But they're getting there by subway, and there's a long past behind them. So this tells me a lot about them. They were cultured and educated, dressed well, headed out for the night, but not taking a car. And this would have been probably early 1900s would be my guess. The white gloves, it was probably way before the Spanish flu, but white gloves were common. And so I'm looking at all the clues now. He had a broad hat. She had kind of a temperance hat of the suffragists wore not the big brimmed hats, but narrower ones. So those are the clues I was looking for as a art historian. So my sister found their names. They were both from, the family tree is from upstate New York and near the Adirondacks and in the Adirondacks. She is Margaret McKillop, and they lived in a settlement that was created by a group of Irish Catholics from Northern Ireland. And he is James Franklin, and he lived at the fork of the All Sable River at the base of, both of them lived actually in the Adirondacks, but it's where the silt from the river settled. So they still have a working farm on the same area, but they lived 20 miles apart. The only way you could get back and forth was by horse. So what I discovered was both of them went to church in Black Brook, 10 miles from their home. And that's probably where they met. They moved to Chicago, 1885. That's when the industrial changes were taking place. Changes in the 1890s were just like the changes we have right now. I looked at the year that they moved to Chicago. It's just as soon as the trains went from Burlington, New York, and to Chicago. It's called the Grand Trunk Railroad. And they probably would have stayed and helped harvest and preserve in their settlement before moving. It probably made a little money then. Both of them were the only generation that died young. Everybody else lived into their 80s and 90s. So I thought something must have happened that caused them to not survive till old age. And this is where the historic element comes in, where there was a circus accident and Jumbo the elephant died. And that was in September of 1885 on their way to Chicago. Screeching brakes woke them. Their train car shuddered to a lurching stop. Watch out, Margaret shouted as she and James were knocked into the wall of the boxcar, buffeted by their satchels. Suitcases slid and tumbled to jab their ribs and legs. Let's get out of here before the train takes off. They gathered their belongings and rushed to the partially open door. The train jerked forward, and a high-pitched, bellowing animal scream, like a fluted pipe, filled the air. Then silence. Men were yelling and calling. They heard, "He's over, back her up, get off him," amidst a hollow wail. What's that sound, James? Margaret looked frightened at what she couldn't see. It's some kind of animal, I think. It's louder than an ox and higher pitched, James said. An ear-splitting, trumpeting tapered to a purring, sputtering sound that churned like an ailing engine. Then a loud trumpeting again. Early morning light filtered through the partially open door. Reverberations between the metal train cars calmed, and they stood to feel for bodily injury. The locomotive then revved up and reversed backwards. Margaret and James were jolted to the metal floor. The train tipped. The sound of crates of china and glass shuffled, slid, and then shattered against the sides of the car, along with Margaret and James. The train car strained its connections, derailed, and suddenly fell sideways. A flash of sunlight flooded through the car's sliding door, now on the top, giving a view of the wispy clouds swiping a blue sky. In the distance, a symphony of trumpeting overlapping with the echoes of trumpeting. Climb along the sides, Margaret. We can get out on top, maybe unseen, James hoarsely called from the bottom of the sideways train car. I don't know if I can move, Margaret groaned. I hit the side hard. My hip is locked. That gives me a little clue as to the past. These are some drawings that Dad did. He was in World War II, about the last guy in Chicago to go, and right before the draft for 21-year-olds. He was 20 when he enlisted in the Navy to learn to fly. Dad's helicopter encaustics hung on our walls. Their motion is more important than the structure, which is obscured by atmosphere swirling abstractly. I'm not going up in one of those, Dad said, gesturing at a helicopter during our family vacation. What was his fascination? What was his fear? His ink drawing was technical, as if trying to understand its function. From an airplane pilot's view, the helicopter should not fly. His ink drawing, while active, is schematic, skeletal, nearly a scientific drawing. The artist is trying to examine how the mechanism flies. Another helicopter drawing is prismatic, dividing the air, balancing color and design, like a spinning plate of equal measures. Why did he paint one horizontally and another one vertically? Helicopter in red, white, and blue, it must have symbolized the American flag. His action indicates the midpoint climax in my story. When he was nearly 90, Mac finally went into the World War II Army Air Force reunion when he was a pilot of the B-17 bomber. And a speaker by the name of Tex Cornyn, who was the co-pilot of the plane he was in that was shot down, wrote the story of Dad's plane as it was being shot down over Frankfurt, Germany. It's the first time I heard or read anything about it. On 1945, a January day in Germany's coldest winter on record, he parachuted into flak-filled skies. Dad, or Mac in my story, it's the character, painted these spinning airborne contraptions that showed me the emotion of a B-17 cruising, then spiraling into space. Throttling on, engine 1 and 2, co-pilot Rose shouted as the Texas co-pilot Rose throttled down on engines 1 and 2 and got the plane out of the centrifugal force that pinned everyone in. Rose throttled back. The plane righted itself. Mac exhaled with relief. Navigator came in over the interphone. Set, Mac replied, and reached for his instruments to calculate a new heading. We might make it. If only the fire blows out, we might make it. Rose came over the interphone again. there was an ominous pause, then prepare to bail out. So this is the high point of my story, where everything changes. He was a pilot on 16 missions, and all of a sudden he's headed into the hell of Germany in 1945. In 1955, their war service continued to nudge society in a more just direction through painting and writing. Irene was a writer. In 1955, Life magazine commissioned Dad to draw and paint the Emmett Till trial in Sumner, Mississippi. Brown versus the Board of Education had already been decided for equal education for all children the year before. During the trial, Emmett's uncle Mose Wright stood up and pointed at the perpetrators. A few months after the trial, Rosa Parks refused to stand up in the back of the bus with Emmett Till in mind. The civil rights movement began that year. So 1956, the year before I'm born, this is another encaustic that was on the wall that I grew up, in the house where I grew up. I saw it all the time. I never wondered about it. Dad gave it to me. It was on my wall while my kids grew up. Never wondered about it until I'm like, why would you move a family of 7 children, including I was an infant at the time, to Franco's Spain? So I turned the painting over, and the painting is called Red Sky. And it particularly in Chicago, McCarthyism ran rampant. There were a lot of creative types who were blacklisted and not able to work for the rest of their lives. And Dad's like, I can't do that. So 2 years after the Emmett Till trial, probably perpetuated by having painted for the Emmett Till trial, Mac and Irene packed our family to live in Franco, Spain to avoid McCarthyism. Blacklisting would hinder Dad's work after he reported by drawing the Emmett Till trial. Franco was anti-communist, so living in Spain would certify Mom and Dad non-communists. We lived there for a year. So for my older brothers and sisters who were 7 or 5 years old, they said, oh yeah, it was a few months out of my life. For me, it was the first year of my life. So it was kind of a big deal. So that is kind of, we've gone through the climax. We've had a couple of dark moments of first the Emmett Till and the racism in the United States, and then McCarthyism. And here we are arriving in Spain in a plane that one engine had blown out, and their whole family is on the plane. So there was just another element to it all. So when I was 5 months old, in the 7th of 9 children, we moved to Torremolinos, Spain. Dad's encaustic told me what it was like, how busy the streets were. Mom's writing said that the sounds were African, where the sights were European. So these little clues gave me enough to write a chapter on, of what it was like to be an infant and growing up there. We lived on a rancho overlooking Malaga Bay. Malaga is where Picasso is from, and he spent a lot of time in this town of Torremolinos that has. And so now we're settling down, but even after a climax, these are all very trying and troubling things. So the story kind of steps down to more of a calm. And then in the conclusion and with the solution, we're a family growing up in Spain. And this is a drawing Dad did of mostly the preschool age brothers and sisters. I'm the baby on the left. And that's kind of the start of my story, or sorry, the first chapter that's a prelude into the story that I start then in chronological order. And the outline is like what we have here on the left. I picked this because I'm working right now on a suffragist scene in 1851 when there were so many changes similar to today's in our country. So the women are also trying to establish themselves as having some rights. And so you know, in any one of these outlines, you could probably do a better job than I, but it helped me to take the snippets and put them into a linear form. And then I could go back and look at the story structure and make sure that I got those arcs. Inside of each story, I tried to have a mini arc, a mini story in each chapter with an overarching arc, so that you get a rhythm to it, you kind of learn how to read it, and then you are not surprised when, oh my gosh, we're on another adventure, and then we're on another. So there are these kind of peaks that happen, and there's a resolution that happens in the entire overarching storyline. And with one of my mantras that's on the top of get in and out early, GILO, as a reminder that when you are doing a scene, you might need a little rev up to start writing, but most of that should be tossed out. And when you start the action, that's the time to start the scene. So these are my percentages that solve the problem for me to how to take a linear family line and make it into an engaging story that people want to turn the pages and see what happens next. Now, especially in the suffragists, I want to share with you this Redex. I'll put this in the chat. It's a link of any period in US history. You can go on and read what the newspapers were saying at that time. So I found out in this settlement that I've been writing about recently, there was a cougar that everybody was scared of. And somebody went out to check on their field, and oh my gosh, the cougar was there. So I'll stop sharing this so I can get back into chat. And so Redex is where you can go to read newspaper articles and get some of the liveliness of the time, what people were thinking about, worrying about. And then for developmental edits, I also wish I knew this really early on, because I'd gotten my snippets together, I'd done my arc. So I went to Reedsy, and in Reedsy, which is out of England, you can pick your editor. And even though I already had a contract with a publishing company, I picked an editor that had already published books with the themes that I was working with. Here are some places you can go to publish your book, and to, family tree searches and things like that. But there are actually, if you're writing it for your family only, there are hardbound versions with gold leaf titles on them. And this gives you a list of where you can go to make enough copies for all your cousins and aunts and uncles. So that is probably enough. I'd love to hear from you and what your adventures have been.